Hi, my name is Caesar and I want to welcome you to this introductory course on learning HTML. If you're here, I'm assuming you're interested in learning how to code to become a web developer. And I want to quickly congratulate you on taking that step. I'm sure it will change your life for the better. I know it changed mine since I first started working as a professional full-stack web developer 15 years ago. So before we move on to learning HTML, I want to give you some context so you know how the coding part fits into the big picture. Let's start by looking at what a website is. I'm sure you've seen many websites, but have you ever thought about how they work? What is behind all those good-looking pages in your browser? Where does that content come from? And where does it go? What is a URL and why do you need one? And finally, what is a web server and why all websites use them? We'll quickly go through all these questions so you have a solid foundation for learning HTML. So let's look at how the browser loads its content. The first step when you open a browser is to type in an address, also called a URL or Uniform Resource Locator. For this example, we'll load up google.com. After you type google.com into your address bar and hit enter, the page loads and you can continue to the next page and so on. But what's actually happening behind the scenes? See, your browser doesn't know about google.com or mixandgo.com or any other URL. To your browser, those letters are gibberish. But what it does when you press enter is it sends the URL to another machine on the internet to translate it to something that it can understand. Computers in general don't do well with words, they prefer numbers. So that machine on the internet that does the translation is called a DNS, or a domain name system. And based on the URL sent by the browser, it responds with an internet address, also called an IP address. Which looks like this. It's just 4 numbers from 0 to 255 separated by dots. And that IP address is the exact address of the machine that holds the page content for google.com or mixandgo.com or whatever their website is. But more importantly, it is an address that computers can understand. This type of machines that hold content for web pages are called web servers. And the web server's job is to send and receive data to and from the browser. But the data that the browser receives from the server doesn't look anything like what you see when you look at the website. The data is actually HTML code, because again, computers are weird and they understand code better than they understand images and colors and such. So the browser takes the code from the web server and it uses it to build a page that we humans can look at. That code is telling the browser how the page needs to look like and what it should contain. And the big part of it is the HTML code, the subject of this course. But before we start learning how to write HTML code, there's one more thing you need. You need a code editor. And the one I recommend is Visual Studio Code. You can go to this URL to install it. Follow the installation steps and then start the code editor. Now write anything you want and then save the file as first.html somewhere on your computer. Then open up the browser and load the file you just saved by going to File, Open, then locate the file on your computer. You can see that the browser rendered the contents of the file. In this case, the contents of the web page sits on your local computer, but because you want to show the website to the world, you will need a web server when that time comes. But for now, this is how we'll build our HTML code. By writing something to a file using the code editor and then opening the file in the browser. So now you're ready to learn some HTML. HTML is one of the most common languages you see on the internet today. All websites, big or small, are built using HTML. It's one of the 3 languages that the browser understands. And while we're not going to talk about all 3 in this course, just know that the most important of the 3 is the HTML language. The other 2 are called CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and JavaScript. And each one of the 3 languages has a very specific purpose when it comes to building websites and web applications. HTML is called a markup language. It's a language that you'll use to describe and organize the content of your web page, also called an HTML document. CSS, on the other hand, is a presentation language that is used to display the contents of your HTML document in a more appealing way. In other words, it's used to make web pages pretty. And the last one, the last of the three, is JavaScript. JavaScript is a programming language that you can use to build interactive web pages. And now that you know what each one of the three languages is for, we can continue focusing on the HTML language. So, let's begin by looking at what the language looks like. Here is a code example which describes a very simple HTML document. If that looks intimidating, don't worry, I will explain what it all means in just a moment. As you can probably see, there is some text between angle brackets colored in pink, and some more text in black. The pink parts are called tags, and they can either wrap some text, the parts in black, or they can wrap other tags as a way of structuring the document. If you look at the top of the code, you will see a tag called doctype. The doctype tag describes the rest of the document as being an HTML document. The next tag underneath that is the HTML tag, which is composed of an opening tag and a closing tag at the end of the code example. The HTML tag wraps the entire document, and it's used as a starting point for all documents of the HTML type. And all HTML documents have a predetermined but flexible structure that you need to follow in order for your documents to be valid HTML documents. The code that you see on the screen is an example of such structure. You can see the head tag and the body tag. They describe how the document is laid out so the browser can make sense of its contents. So if you look at the contents of the head tag, you'll see it contains another tag called title, which wraps some text. Also, the body tag contains an h1 tag called a heading tag and a p tag called a paragraph tag, both also wrapping some text. And let's see how the browser makes use of that HTML code. As you can see, it uses the title tag to display a page title in the browser's tab bar. And it's using the h1 heading tag to format the text it wraps as a big and bolded heading. Notice how the paragraph tag looks different. It's because the browser by default chose to display those tags the way we see them here. Namely, the heading in big and bolded text and the paragraph in smaller, unbolded text. Now, let's take a look at a few more HTML tags. As you can see in this code example, I have added another paragraph and an unordered list. An unordered list is what you can see here between the opening UL and the closing UL tags. And each line in the list is wrapped by LI tags, or line item tags. Let's see how those new tags look like in the browser. I know this doesn't look like much right now, but keep in mind that we are currently focusing on defining the structure of the document, and not the styling. As you might recall, the job of the HTML language is to define the structure of the document. And if the structure is defined correctly, it will make it very easy to style it the way you want later on. But right now, we are looking at the default browser styling, which looks okay, but it's not impressive at all. Okay, so you can see how each line item in the list has a bullet in front of it. That is how unordered lists look like by default. If you're asking yourself why it's called an unordered list, it's because there is also an ordered list available. And that puts a number in front of each line item as opposed to bullets. Okay, so let's move on to one of the most important features of the HTML language, and that is linking pages together. Linking allows us to navigate from page to page by defining a relation of sorts between pages. This is what allows websites to have multiple related pages. In order to define such a link, you need to use the link tag, which looks like the one in the code example. But you might have noticed that there's more to it than what we've seen so far with the previous tags. It too has an opening and closing tag, and it also wraps some text. But there's a new href attribute and its value. All HTML tags can have attributes, it's just that most of them work fine without specifying any of them. But for the link tag, if you don't specify which page you want to link to, it won't do anything. So that is why we need to put that href attribute in there, because we want to explicitly instruct the link tag to link to page2.html document. Now if you load this page in the browser, you'll notice that the link tag is colored in blue by default. And if you click it, it will load the page2.html document. And that is how linking works. Now let's spice up the page a little bit by adding some media to it. In this code example, we are adding an image tag which also has an attribute. Just like the link tag had the href attribute, this one has a source attribute for locating the image. So the source attribute needs you to tell it which image file to load. I have placed an image called kids.jpg in the same folder where the HTML file is located, and I can instruct the image tag to load the kids.jpg file on the page by placing the file name in the value of the attribute. Another thing that I want to point out here is that the image tag can also be written as an unpaired tag, meaning it's got no closing tag. When the HTML tag doesn't need to wrap text or other HTML tags, you can write it in its unpaired version. And here's what the browser makes of it. It renders the heading, the paragraph, and then it loads the file from your file system and puts it on the page where the image tag is. Now let's look at something more interesting. Let's add a video to the page. That tag is called an iframe tag, and it's what YouTube gives you when you go to the Share and Embed section. Okay, so now let's look at what the YouTube video looks like when displayed on the page. That looks pretty cool. Next up are HTML tables. Tables allow you to display the data on the page in a spreadsheet-like style. Here's an example of what a spreadsheet looks like. If you're familiar with Microsoft Excel or Google Spreadsheets, then you understand what a spreadsheet looks like. But HTML tables are just for displaying data in a similar style. They don't allow you to edit the data or anything like that. They're used solely for displaying the data. So let's take a look at an example. The rest of the HTML code is hidden, but it's identical to what you've seen so far, with the heading on the top of the page and the paragraph underneath it. And underneath that, we have this table code. So let's look at each tag and see what it's for. The top one is the table tag, and it wraps all the other tags that are specific to an HTML table. Inside the table tag, we can see a TR tag, which stands for table row, and it wraps 3 TH tags that stand for table heading. So basically, at the top of the table, we'll see a row with 3 heading columns called first name, last name, and age. Closing the TR tag means that is where the table row ends. And we can start another row just like we do in this example, but this time instead of TH, we have TDs, which stand for table data. And they will fill the 3 columns on the second row of the table. Then we have one last row with 3 more columns. Now let's take a look at the browser to see how this code is rendered. The default table styling is hideous if you ask me. There's nothing to it really, aside from bolding the heading columns. We can do better though by adding a few table attributes. I don't recommend you do this in practice because if you recall, the way the data is presented should be the job of the CSS code. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I will show you a few old tricks just to have some fun with this table. So the first thing you can do is add a border to the table. And this is how you do it. You add a border attribute with a value of how thick you want the border to be. And that code puts a border of 1 pixel around the whole table, and it also puts a border on each table cell. Now we can clearly see how the cells are separated, but it still looks hideous. So let's try something else. We can center the table in the browser window by adding an align attribute with a value of center. And that centers it. And to improve its readability, let's add some color and spacing to it. There. That's a tiny bit better. Like I said, styling should not be part of your HTML code, even if you can do it using these old and deprecated attributes. But what you can do with HTML code as far as tables are concerned, you can tell it to merge cells and rows, and that could be useful sometimes, so let's take a look at it now. Merging two table cells or columns together is done via the colspan attribute. The value of the colspan is the number of columns you want to merge. In this case, I want to merge two columns. And here's how that looks in the browser. Next, let's also merge some rows together. We can use the rowspan attribute to do it. By adding the rowspan to a cell, you're telling the browser that the cell will span two rows, or the number of rows you want. And here's how that looks in the browser. Everything we've seen so far was about what a document already contains, which means all of it was just a way to structure existing data. But what about creating new data? How does that work? Well, that is what HTML forms are for. Forms are used to get input from users and send it to a server somewhere to be processed. That server can do whatever it wants with the data. It can store it in a database, it can send it via email, etc. We're not concerned with what the server does or what it can do in this course. Right now, all we care about is HTML. And in this case, HTML forms. So HTML forms are a collection of widgets that can capture user input. Be it input fields where the user can type text, or checkboxes, or buttons, you name it. So let's look at a few examples. In this first example, you can see there are two input fields. One for the first name and one for the last name. The field for the first name has a label next to it to indicate to the user what the field is for. You can see that the label and the input fields are linked together by this for attribute on the label. The attribute corresponds to the input field's ID. That's how it knows what field to link to. And it's the same for the last name field. It too has a label and an ID for linking the label to it. One more thing that you can see here is this type attribute, which indicates how the input field will behave. In this case, it's a regular text field, but there are many more types of fields available, like fields for passwords that hide what the user is typing, or fields for numbers or checkboxes, etc. And the last attribute is the name attribute, and it is used to name each field's data when it's sent to the server. So the data corresponding to the first name field will arrive at the server that processes it as being named fname. And the data for the last name field will be named lname on the server side. Before we get to the last input there, you might have noticed the BR tags. Those tags are just to add line breaks between the two fields. Without them, everything would be on the same line. Okay, so let's look at the last input here. The type of it is submit, and it's used to send form data to the server. It looks like a button in the browser, a button that says submit, because that's what its value is. Now let's switch to the browser and take a look at the rendered version of this form. You can see that there is a label that says first name, and immediately after it is an input field that allows you to add text. Then there's a new line that you don't really see, but you can see that the next label begins on the next line. So the second label says last name, and then it too has a field for entering text. And immediately following the input is another line break. Lastly, the submit input looks like a button, and it says submit. When you click on this button, the data is going to be sent to the server somewhere. Not in this case though, because we haven't configured a server to process the data. But just so you know that that's the job of the submit button, and most forms out there have at least one button. Now let's look at a few more inputs, namely, we'll take a look at the radio button field. This input type allows you to select a single value out of multiple values. In this case, for example, it allows you to select your favorite color, but you can only pick one of the two options. Notice its similarities with the text field. It has an ID to link the label to, it has a name to send the value to the server, and it has a value for choosing which of the two options you want the server to receive. And here's how the radio button looks like when rendered by the browser. Similarly, you can use the checkbox field to select multiple values. So with the radio button, you can only have one value selected, but with the checkbox field, you can allow the user to select multiple values. Here's how that code looks like. As you can see, the type has changed to checkbox from radio, and instead of having the same value for the name attribute, now we have different values. Aside from that, everything stays the same. And here's how the browser renders it. Now, the user can either choose blue or both blue and green. Another very commonly used input is the select input, also called a drop-down. It's used to select a value from a long list of options. It looks a bit cleaner than the radio or the checkbox, especially if you have a lot of options. In this example, we have a drop-down for selecting a car brand. And here's how the browser renders it. These are just a few of the most common inputs used, but there are many more. And since you're not going to use all of them that often, here's a list just to show you that there are many more options available for you to build your forms. Congratulations! You now know enough HTML to build 90% of the web pages you see today. HTML pages are just structure and content, so with HTML all you need is to structure the content. But then comes the styling, if you want to make the pages look nice. And then the programming part, if you want your website to respond to user interactions and generate new content based on user actions. In this short HTML course, we're not going to learn either CSS or programming. But for now, I do have a trick for you that you can use to build nice-looking websites with just HTML. And the trick is to use a pre-built CSS framework. All you need to do is to place a new attribute in your HTML code, and the pages will magically make themselves prettier. So let's dive in. The CSS framework I'm talking about is called Bootstrap, and you can find it at getbootstrap.com. And to install it in your own HTML code, you want to add this line between the head tags, just like I show here. And that is all you need to do to be able to use Bootstrap in your HTML code. Now go ahead and reload that page in your browser and notice the difference. Since we don't have that much content here, there's not that much that you can see right now. But we're going to look at a few cool things you can do with Bootstrap. So let's add 2 more paragraphs to this page. Now, if you reload the page, it will look like this. Nothing interesting yet, but let's make it interesting. Remember I mentioned a new attribute you need to add in order to use this Bootstrap framework? Well, that attribute is called a class attribute. And if you make the value of it something that Bootstrap understands, it will make that specific element or the entire page look nicer. Let's try it. I'm going to wrap those paragraphs in a div tag and give that div a class of row. And I'm also going to give each paragraph a class of col, which stands for column. Reloading that page will display those 3 paragraphs in a spreadsheet-like style with a row and 3 columns. This is very useful for changing the layout of your HTML page. Where before all the elements were one after the other, now you can get a lot more creative and create different sections on the page. For example, a sidebar in the content area, like you see on blogs. Or you could create a pricing page with the 3 pricing sections in the middle of the page. There's no limit to what you can do with CSS, and this Bootstrap framework gives you a shortcut. Let's look at a few more examples. Here's what an alert looks like. It's basically just a div with some text, but displayed as blue text on a blue background. And just by changing the name of one class, you can have different styles. Here's an example. All I've changed is the name of the alert class, and the color of the alert changed. Let's look at another element. Here are 3 different ways of styling buttons. When rendered, they'll look like this. The first one is blue, the second one is gray, and the third one is green. And all that just by changing a few class names. But this is not all you can do with Bootstrap. I encourage you to go to their website and try out a few more examples. All you need to do is copy and paste their example code in your file and then load it in the browser. There are a lot more things that I didn't show you here, and it's good practice to try to discover them on your own. Here are a few more. Button groups or cards or forms, and especially forms, these are so common in everyday coding. I hope this gives you an idea of what's possible with just HTML. You don't have to learn CSS or programming to be able to build these pages. But if you are looking to get a job as a programmer, you will have to go further. You'll have to learn CSS and some programming because you'll want to create custom styles, and you'll have to create programs that change the contents of the page in different ways. Most companies out there will want you to know at least HTML, CSS, and one programming language like Ruby or JavaScript or Python, etc. And they also want you to know other things like databases and SQL, setting up your own development environment, and version control, and responsive design, and working with the command line, and debugging, and modern preprocessors. So if you are interested in exploring these topics and becoming a full-stack web developer, make sure you are subscribed, as I'll be creating more free content that you might find useful. Thank you for watching and take care.